Right. The European Union and Brazil have a well-established partnership based upon a common heritage and shared fundamental values and principles such as democracy, human rights, fundamental freedoms, social inclusions, and sustainable development. Brazil and the EU also share strong cultural and historical ties, and Brazil was one of the first countries to establish diplomatic relations with the EU and is now a long-standing strategic partner of the EU. Needless to say, the EU is following closely international development in Brazil, particularly against the background of the turmoil that followed the election of President Lula in January this year. We are also very much interested in the new role Brazil intends to play on the international scene and its attempts to work on a peaceful settlement of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. However, some of the statements made by Brazilian authorities last week, which seem to indicate a willingness to side with Russia and to put on an equal footing the aggressor and the aggressed in this brutal and unjustified war, are puzzling, to put it mildly. I'm glad that President Lula made some important clarifications afterwards, and we would welcome a clear position from Brazil on this issue, which is fundamental for us all in Europe. In parallel, we are witnessing a welcome renewed momentum on the Mercosur agreement, which would undoubtedly boost the already strong Brazil-EU trade relations. With all this in mind, I invited Ms. Veronique Lorenzo, Head of Division for South America and the External Action Service, to give us an account of the latest development in Brazil and on the state of play of the Mercosur agreement. So without further ado, the floor goes to Ms. Lorenzo for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chair. Thank you for the invitation to the EAS. We're very pleased our relations with Brazil are extremely important. This is one of our two strategic partners in the region, and the relationship has not lived up to that status of strategic partnership up to now. And from the beginning of this new government, our purpose has been to really step up and comply with our purpose, which is to revitalize the relationship with Brazil. Since the beginning of the year, since the beginning of President Lula's term, I think we have started to comply with this objective, and we've had an extremely busy calendar of meetings, of contacts, and that clearly shows the interest on both sides to re-engage. We've had exchanges between President Lula and President of the Commission, President of the Council. HRVP Borrell has had several meetings with his counterpart, Foreign Minister Mauro Vieira. We've had two missions so far by EVP Vestager and EVP Timmermans, and these have been the opportunity to start discussions on how to restart that relationship and deepen cooperation on crucial themes like climate change, environment, and digital development. There are several other missions in the pipeline, including by AFET, by the Delegation for Brazil, by INTA, ENVI, also by Commissioners Johansson and Sinkevicius, and possibly the President of the Commission. And of course, when we look at President Lula's busy international agenda, it's very clear that Brazil is back as a global player. Perhaps let me start referring to what you mentioned now about that has been in the headlines over the past few weeks. We've all heard President Lula's statements on the Russian invasion of Ukraine during his mission to China and to the United Arab Emirates. First of all, I think it's important to say that we appreciate Brazil's support for the multilateral order and its clear condemnation of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine in multilateral fora, including in the UN General Assembly. And more recently, last week, in fact, President Lula has repeated that in Portugal and yesterday in Spain. But defending the UN Charter also means that there can be no equidistance between aggressor and attacked. and if Russia stops its aggression and withdraws from Ukrainian territory, the war ends. If Ukraine stops defending itself, Ukraine will be destroyed and the nation and the country would cease to exist. The Russian war is an imperialistic war aimed at recreating the outdated spheres of influence, not from Soviet times, but from the time of the Russian Empire. We want what President Lula wants, an end to this war that has been imposed by Russia on its neighbor. As you mentioned, Chair, President Lula himself later clarified his statements, and I believe that it's very clear they're not buying into the Russian narrative. But they're not unequivocally buying our narrative to the full extent either. And this, I think, underlines the need for us to strengthen our dialogue and our engagement at all levels, bilaterally, regionally, and globally. If I turn, and you've asked me to give you an update of where we are in the prongs of in the dimensions of our relationship, I would mention three themes: our bilateral relationship, our strategic partnership. Secondly, where we are in the conclusion of the agreement with EU-Mercosur. And thirdly, our engagement in regional and global fora. So to start with this strategic partners, I mentioned already from the start of the year, an important number of steps have been taken. And that has given the framework for our future joint work, and these are the themes we're working on. The mission by VP Timmermans in January was an opportunity to step up dialogue and cooperation on climate change and environment. And what's been discussed is the launching of a high-level dialogue on climate change and environment at ministerial level, and the intensification of joint work on green hydrogen. And to see that's one of the themes that is an irritant is the EU legislation on deforestation-free value chains, and we need to see how to better work together to explain and cooperate for the better implementation of this legislation. The mission by VP Vestager in March was clearly highlighted the scope for synergies in the area of digital cooperation, science and technology. Brazil has a keen interest to discuss digital inclusiveness and to continue the exchange on best regulatory approaches concerning digital platforms, digital markets, and artificial intelligence, and also to re-establish the high-level dialogue on information society and the digital economy. And the VP Vestager also discussed how to deepen the cooperation that has been very fruitful in the past years in science and technology. These are priorities for Brazil, they're priorities for us. They are a very positive agenda that need to be pursued. We're working on that. And of course, there are many more areas we need to explore, including different themes that are rising in the agenda, such as security and defense, or the increasing problem of addressing organized crime. If I turn to the second part, which is the conclusion of the EU-Mercosur agreement, we have, I think, we've all heard the latest declarations, and from both sides, there's keen interest to conclude. The latest was a meeting in early March by the chief negotiators, and there they clearly demonstrated the renewed momentum. We agreed we would not be reopening texts that were concluded for the trade part in 2019, for the political and cooperation part in 2020. And that all efforts would be made to try and reach a conclusion by the summit. One of the main outstanding issues is the additional instrument that details aspects of sustainability of the agreement. That draft was for the first time presented to our Mercosur partners in Buenos Aires, and they have expressed concerns. We are still waiting for comments on their side, but we know that, as I mentioned, the EU legislation on deforestation-free value chains, this is one of their main concerns. They're concerned about the impact of the EU Green Deal legislation, and they argue that this has changed the goalposts that were negotiated in the agreement we reached in 2019 by introducing new requirements for exports to the EU. They also want the text to better reflect environmental concerns, will go hand in hand with some other of their priorities, such as social inclusion and economic development. So at this stage, I think it's important we're open to their concerns. We are awaiting their reaction to this. The next round of negotiations should take place in May, and of course we have been very, very open in expressing that we're ready to cooperate, to provide cooperation to accompany the implementation of this agreement. Thirdly, I turn to the Brazil as a regional and global player, and in our efforts to reinvigorate EU-LAC relations, Brazil is central. There have been several démarches, and we sincerely hope that President Lula will be able to attend the EU-CELAC summit in July, on the 17th and 18th of July. And Brazil, of course, is a key player to find solutions in regional issues, regional crises such as Venezuela. Both countries have re-established relations recently. The diplomatic advisor to President Lula, Mr. Amorim, visited Venezuela in March. We as the EU are extremely committed to a resolution of the crisis, and we believe that jointly we could be an important lever towards finding a peaceful and democratic way out of the crisis. So both the EU and Brazil can only gain by working closer together. We have, as you know, strong cultural, interpersonal ties. We share the same values. We have strong trade. We're still the strongest investor in Brazil. And we're now really implementing what we said we would do, which is to step up our dialogue and cooperation. Now is the time to deliver on this partnership. We need to find a landing spot for the EU-Mercosur agreement and deliver more on what has been the framework that has been traced by the missions of EVPs Vestager and Timmermans. I think your forthcoming missions to Brazil will be an important piece of that building block of that edifice. And of course, we stand ready to support any of your efforts. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's working. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Lorenzo. So we will continue our exchange of views with the Chair of Parliament Delegation for Relations with the Federative Republic of Brazil, Mr. José Manuel Fernandes. Mr. Fernandes, you have the floor for 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will speak Portuguese. Muito obrigado, senhora.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I also wanted to congratulate Mrs. Lorenzo for all the hard work that she's made on this operation. And the key word is really cooperation. We need to look at Africa and Latin America and try to negotiate, bearing in mind, not thinking that we're at the forefront everywhere, but rather just to try to embark on joint development based on European values, democracy, freedom, defense of human life, and human dignity. And these should serve as the basis for development. As regards Latin America, Brazil is a fundamental country, and it's essential, important, and even crucial that it advances toward the EU-Mercosur agreement. This agreement represents 150 million people, 25% of global GDP, and it would not only allow for a geopolitical order that is based on the values that I've just mentioned, but also it would be a win-win on both sides. And we mustn't fear moving forward towards Mercosur on the basis of protectionism, which may exist in a variety of areas. Brazil is the 5th largest country in the world. It represents about half of the Latin American population and half of the population of the European Union. It's the 12th largest world economy. And in terms of cooperation, there's much that can be done in the area of digital technology, the environment, climate change, forestry, the sea, defense of human rights. And therefore, I think it is essential, and indeed it would be extremely positive, for example, for in July at the SLX summit that we conclude this agreement, even to try to build peace, because peace is an essential precondition for cooperation. And so this is what I am putting forward, I think, is the position that the EU should take, and specifically the European Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mrs. Fernandes, now for S&D we have Isabel Santos for 2 minutes.
Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. After my compatriot and colleague José Manuel Fernandes righteous words, I can say very little except for emphasize the importance of the agreement EU-Mercosur, especially given that at the moment Brazil is experiencing a profound change when it comes to its environmental policy. And over the last few years in Brazil, its environment policy has been a problem and an obstacle towards progress in the Mercosur agreement. But provided that Brazil is ready to launch in the carbon trading market, and it prepares forestry programs that fight deforestation and even recover forest, both in the forest and in the Mata Atlântica. So then we have everything we need to stop postponing this agreement and to actually make progress on it. It is of vital importance, not just for Portugal or Spain or a subset of EU countries. It's of vital importance to all of us, because from a strategic point of view, this is going to define action and cooperation of extreme importance. And it's also extremely important for Latin America for a number of reasons, and also because there is an urgent, absolutely urgent need to resolve the conflict in Venezuela towards democracy and peace. And this is something that we need to do. And this agreement gives us the necessary foundations to be able to strengthen our connection so that this can become a reality. And here, there was talk about the agreement, the need to establish this agreement. But I'd like to know more about the actual timetable that we're going to follow, because it's all very well to talk about objectives, but we need to have concrete, clear objectives. Thank you.
Very much. And for Renew, we don't have anyone. Greens, no. ID, no. For the left, Mick Wallace.
Thanks very much, President. You made the point that Lula hasn't bought into the Russian narrative on the war, and you say that neither has he bought into the EU-US-NATO narrative. And and you say there might be need for more dialogue with him on that basis. Is there not an acceptance that, I mean, it's very important, of course, that he doesn't buy into the Russian narrative, but he is calling for peace, and he is on the side of countries containing over 80% of the world's population who are refusing to take sides, are looking for peace, and Lula is clearly in this camp, and he's unlikely to move out of it. And surely this idea that you're either with us or against us, as originally quoted by Bush back in 2003 when he was illegally invading Iraq, surely this is not a healthy way forward, and that if countries are not taking sides and are looking for peace, if the EU isn't going to respect that position, are we not going to be isolating ourselves from over 80% of the world's population? Thank you.
We have Mr. Rangel for the EPP.
Thank you very much, Chair. I will speak in Portuguese because I'd like to recall everybody that Portuguese language is the 5th in the world, the 3rd in the West, and the 1st in the South Hemisphere. And Brazil is the only country from the BRICS that has as official language and only language an European language. Primeiro, gostava só...
First of all, I'd like to say how much I admire the work of my colleague José Manuel Fernandes as president of the delegation in extremely difficult circumstances, in a very hostile counterpart, in a hostile environment in the European Union, and the pandemic has very much made work difficult. And I know that this will be resumed in May in a very effective way with a presence in Brazil. And then I won't say anything more about the Mercosur agreement because my two previous colleagues were very clear about that. I would, however, like to touch upon 3 points. The first is Brazil's position towards Russia, which has caused a bit of perplexed responses, but in their assembly, they were always in favor of peace in the international arena. And now in the Lisbon Declaration, the joint Lisbon Declaration, Lula, I think rightly said, and was in fact encouraged by our party, the EPP, and very rightly managed to have a declaration which was considerably far beyond what Lula has normally said. There are some contradictions between this declaration and previous ones, but it's progress. And this has to do with our political partnership with Brazil, because the European Union hasn't done very much. During the Bolsonaro presidency, it was very difficult, but really hasn't done much, because if we had a much more intense relationship with Brazil, then clearly Brazil will come closer to your positions for reasons that Mrs. Renzo explained. That is, we have cultural affinities, tremendous cultural affinities. And so, in fact, perhaps they're even closer to us from a cultural point of view than the United States. Also, Brazil has a relationship with Africa, which is also good for us. And there's a triangle, Brazil, Africa, and the European Union. So this is something important. And then one final note. I'd like to point out that President Lula and Brazil, in its external policy, has desired to have a permanent seat in the Security Council, even if it doesn't have a vote. And the European Union should support this, and also for the European Union to have a seat in the Security Council, even if it does initially not have a veto right. Thank you.
Thank you. For S&D, we have Nacho Sanchez Amor.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Yes, thank you, Chair.
É muito de falar português, mas não sei se conseguiria fazê-lo da mesma forma que eu...
Mrs. Lorenzo stuck strictly to the script, and I do apologise for having to say this, the very boring script. Like the two British MPs who got lost somewhere in the countryside when they were on an electoral campaign, and they asked a shepherd, "Where are we?" And the shepherd said, "Well, in a car." And one of the MPs said, This is a perfect example of a parliamentary reply. It's perfectly correct, it's true, but it doesn't provide an ounce of information extra to what we knew before. And I must admit, I have an impression, the same impression when we listen to the EAS. And hearing here in the AFET committee what we've read in the press over the couple of weeks is a bit frustrating. There was a session together with the ambassador of Brazil when the ambassador on the Mercosur agreement said that they weren't going to accept a diktat, which is a political position, of course. And we said, Mr. Fernandez and us, and we said, well, this is something we've been negotiating now for 20 years, so I don't really think you could see it as a diktat in that kind of way. And we've also seen that Brazil has placed on the table a kind of additional alternative statement. So there are negotiations, but it would appear, perhaps you can confirm this, but Brazil has announced a negotiating position or an additional alternative protocol. And given that all of us in this House wish to bring an end to this never-ending file, because of the nature of the file and the overall geopolitical environment in which this agreement will fit in, then I think we are entitled to know what's going on. You have very carefully guarded the Commission's negotiating position, I think, shows the little interest you have. And I don't know whether we are really going to be the guardians of this agreement. So in the light of what you've said, and we would like to know if you have any additional information. How are the negotiations going? What about the negotiating process? Is there an alternative text that has been submitted by Brazil? Because those are the kind of things that are of interest to our Parliament. On everything relating to Russia, I've taken note of Mr. Rangel. And I think if there's more contact, well, I think all of us were rather surprised by this position. Because obviously this is considerably far removed from the solidarity expressed by Bolsonaro with Russia. I think it might be useful for the President to come to Europe because he was in Portugal yesterday, Spain today, and I think it might help President Lula get a better idea of what our perspective and position is. I am concluding we do have a lot of expectations in this new climate with Brazil, but I think we really have to fix them and finalize the agreement because of the geopolitical concerns.
Gracias. For Renew, there's no... Yeah, we have Xavi López.
Muchísimas gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Chair. If I can continue on what Veronique was saying, we had a very complete presentation concerning the relations between Brazil and the European Union. First of all, Brazil is back. You said that yourself, back on the international stage and putting right some of the things that, continuing with what the previous Lula government did, multilateralism, etc., the Mercosur agreement. Obviously, they have strategic interest in that, and they're also playing a specific role on the international scene. And I think if we want to build bridges with others, Brazil is a very large country, so political, diplomatic ties, and we know what the situation is like. Very quickly on Russia, I think in Lisbon and in Madrid, some of these positions have been clarified relating to Brazil. Any peace initiative obviously is more than welcome as long as it is based on the fact that you have an aggressor and then an injured party. Obviously, there are other. We've got Asia, we've got Africa, India, and their positions on the war, which is very different. So obviously, that's the world outside the NATO alliance. We form part of the NATO alliance, so their understanding is different. And I think what we have to do is explain more awareness, and do this at the United Nations. Then 3 specific questions. There was a reference to environmental cooperation and the fight against climate change. I think this is absolutely essential. There's also another area of cooperation when it comes to manufacturing economy, productive economy, which is very important for Lula, other areas of South America, because they want to move away from a mining industry to a more productive economy. When it comes to the Mercosur agreement, and to be quite frank, we have the EAS position, yes, but I don't really know what Europe's position is. And that's something I think that's rather different. Because when the President speaks, we hear that, yes, there is an agreement, we want to introduce more elements into it, and they say, well, if you want to introduce other elements into the agreement, then we have to discuss this, negotiate this, which is quite reasonable. But the President in France has given a public opinion on this, on the agreement, and we've heard positions from the Dutch Parliament. So I don't know whether we in Europe agree to what is being negotiated in agreement. We've heard some more radical comments today, and I think this is the problem. And because obviously the other side in these negotiations will have noted what everybody else in Europe is saying on this. And then Brazil, we know, of course, that the presidency of CELAC has not been very tough. And I think we need a better presence so that we can have a more relevant agenda, leaving aside the whole plan of investments. But I think we have to have a true agenda for the region. Thank you.
And finally, Bernard Guetta.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chair. On the question of Lula's declaration about Russia and Ukraine, I think the explanation is very clear. It can be summed up in a word. Lula is a Latin American. And of course, like all Latin Americans, or almost all, he has psychological, historical, and economic relations which are extremely complex with the United States. Like most Latin Americans, Lula is reticent with respect to the idea that the United States could continue to play a dominant role in the international arena, and is delighted at the idea that the United States weight in the international arena could be moderated. And this is why he has that position. So what should we conclude from this? Could we condemn him? And I condemn his declarations. But politically, what should we do? Well, one thing is simple, is the more the European Union asserts itself in the international arena, the less Lula and many Latin Americans will be uncomfortable or worried about diplomatic, economic, and industrial hegemony on the part of the United States in the international arena. And therefore, let's exist. Let's pull our weight. Talk to Latin America, and specifically with Lula, because this can considerably change things. And in particular, very quickly, or perhaps not very quickly, but certainly quickly, this could really break this front of the global South, because Lula, unlike others, is a Democrat. Thank you.
Merci. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. And I will give you back the floor to answer all these questions.
Thank you very much, Chair. Let me perhaps, there were several themes, one around the Mercosur agreement, one about our position, how to behave in a way with Brazil in terms of their position on Russia, and perhaps a couple of points on our relationship. Let me start, I'll speak in Portuguese, if you don't mind, sobre o acordo do Mercosur, e eu vou discordar com o senhor, deputado.
I would just like to disagree with you, because I think that what we've been saying over the last few years, and it's been over 4 years that I've been working on this issue, and for at least 2 years, we couldn't say anything because there was no political will or even the appropriate conditions to make any progress. We were working continually from a technical point of view on this additional instrument, which I think does address many of the concerns about sustainability and particularly deforestation. But this instrument was put on the back burner for a long time because of the political context. But now with the new government, the new environmental policy, the situation changes completely. And you could see it from the beginning of the year that there is a great deal of will on both sides of the Atlantic to make progress. Now, I could spell it out a little bit more as regards the timetable that we hope to complete. The first thing is of the utmost importance, and that was the first meeting that we had in March of the chief negotiators. And clearly it said that neither party wants to reopen the agreement. And that is fundamental. There wasn't that certainty before that meeting took place. So that's one point. And then a timetable of meetings, monthly meetings, was set. And it is difficult to agree on the June summit, but that is the goal. It's the explicit goal on both sides. So the meeting of 12 chief negotiators every month. The next one will be at the end of May. The one after that will be in June. And we hope that the agreement will be concluded so that it can be announced at the July summit. And we have more details. We'll present this additional instrument, which for so long was stagnating. Mercosur had been asking us for this text for 2 years, and we couldn't share it with them. There was a strong response from Brazil in particular, which on the one hand, there are things, for example, the Paris agreements. These are intentional. The additional instrument establishes that the commitment is compulsory. These are things that they don't like. And then there's a whole part which they think that the instrument is imbalanced because there is a part where they have their priorities, social inclusion, development of industrial policy and so forth, which is not included. And so it is true that they said that there's going to be an alternate proposal to the additional instrument. But we still haven't received that alternative proposal, which ought to be shared before the meeting at the end of May. So that's where we stand. So I'd like to repeat, politically, our situation is entirely different from what it was a few months ago. And this political support comes from us, the European Union, at the highest level. That is on the part of the presidency of the European Union. There are other problems, and that's going to be a matter of us presenting this agreement for the approval of member states, and we'll see what happens. As regards relations with Russia,
we don't believe in the you're either with us or against us. That I've mentioned the fact that we need to continue the dialogue, to strengthen the dialogue, and to have it at all different levels. This is how we can explain the issue. The perspectives are very different from Brazil. It's a war that's far for them. It's not, for us, it's a question of survival. And these things need to be, this needs to be explained. We can agree to disagree, we will never be completely in agreement with Brazil in their position with Russia. They will never agree to sanctions. This is embedded in their long foreign policy tradition. Okay, you know, we take note, we don't have the same position, but that does not prevent us from moving ahead and strengthening our relations. Lastly, I would say that I really think what I've said over the last few years, and we've worked together with. Obrigada por reconhecer.
Thank you for recognizing the hard work of MEP José Manuel Fernandes. They were difficult years, but I would like to say that we've always said that our relationship with Brazil is of utmost importance, and it goes much farther than just a relationship with the government. It's a relationship with the country for the reasons that the MEP has pointed out. And I think that these efforts are now bearing fruit, and you can see that, I think.
Most of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Lorenzo, for this very good overview of the situation. We will continue to follow closely, and in the view of forthcoming AFET mission to Chile and Brazil in June this year, I hope that the insights will be much clearer for the members of this House. Thank you so much. So just for the members, the meeting will continue at 11 o'clock with the votes. Thank you. No.